for that. We'll bring in our panel very shortly. Let's get some legal advice first, though, from the former federal prosecutor, Joe Moreno. Joe, lovely to see you. The fact that Joe Tacopino, Trump's lawyer, did not present a defence case here, how does a jury tend to view that?
Well, Christian, it's interesting because normally in rape cases, they occur in criminal court. As was pointed out, this is civil court. And so a lot of the fundamental rules are different here. And so the attorneys for Ms. Carroll are allowed to make an issue of the fact that Donald Trump did not put a defense on and did not testify in his own behalf. So they can say to the jury, if he really believed in his side of the story, he'd be here to tell it to you personally. You can't do that in criminal court. You can do it here. And so I have to think that probably Donald Trump did not want to make his own defense, because if he got on the stand, he would have to be exposed to cross-examination. And so I have to think that whatever he had to say, he was probably more afraid of the questions he would face from Ms. Carroll's lawyer. So ultimately, he decided it wasn't worth the risk. What the jury did see was a segment of the deposition. So let's play a bit of that.
I don't even know who the woman. Let's see. I don't know who. It's Marla.
You say Marla's in this photo?
That's Marla, yeah. That's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing to? No.
Here.
Carol.
Oh, is that?
The person you just pointed to was
I
E. Jean
see.
Carroll.
Who is that? Who is this?
Point. Your wife. And the woman on the right is your then wife,
I don't know.
Ivana?
This was the picture.
Ivana.
I assume that's John Johnson. Is that?
That's Carol.
Because it's very blurry.
And the reason that's problematic, Joe, is because part of his defence was that E.J. Carroll was not his type, and yet he mistook her for his ex-wife. So again, Christian, these are things that you would not see in a criminal trial, but because it's a civil case, very interesting and different ways of introducing evidence here. And you're right. I mean, Donald Trump at one point said he never met Ms. Carroll, and the fact that there's photographic evidence certainly belies that. What also is a problem here is that the judge in the case allowed the showing of propensity evidence. That's the Access Hollywood tape that was mentioned, and the accounts of other women that said Donald Trump had a propensity for sort of thrusting himself on people and being very aggressive with women. You could not do that in a criminal case, but here in a civil case, the jury sat there and heard that maybe not other accounts of rape against women, but there were certainly accounts from multiple other women that Donald Trump forcibly grabbed them and kissed them. And of course, he said it on videotape. And so I think the jury probably heard quite a bit here, and I'd be nervous if I was Donald Trump right now. Well, because we'll come to E.J. Carroll and her problems in a second with her prosecution, but the problem here is that there was conflicting evidence in this deposition. He said he'd never met her, that she wasn't his type, and then he picked her out instead of his ex-wife. And then he suggested in that deposition, when they told him that there had been this assault, he suggested that she enjoyed it, practically admitting that the encounter took place. So it seems at various points in this deposition, Joe, he conflicts himself, which the jury will see. That's right. And again, in a criminal case, you would not see deposition testimony like this. In a civil case, this is all fair game. And so the jury did not even hear a clear defense put on by Donald Trump, certainly not personally, and not even sort of incidentally through his testimony, which was kind of all over the place on those deposition videotapes. So yeah, Christian, I mean, I have to think that Trump's defense did the best they could with what they had to work with, but it was not a great showing for the former president. Joe, thanks for that. Mick Mulvaney, Joe set out very clearly there Joe Tacopino's problem, and we saw it in that just that small segment of the deposition. If you put him on the stand, he is inclined to go off the script, and that's a problem if you're trying to build a defence.
It is, and it's probably the primary reason you didn't see him testify, despite the fact I think he was in Scotland over the weekend saying that he would fly back to testify, which I'm sure gave his lawyers a heart attack. By the way, they had to defend that statement to the judge either Friday or today to essentially say, look, Judge, you know what we're dealing with here. He goes off and he talks about those types of things and doesn't really mean it. So I don't think anybody really expected him to show up to testify for just the reason that your previous guest mentioned. And it would expose him to all sorts of additional challenges, additional risks, including if he was said something that's not true when he's under oath, then he's got a perjury charge to worry about. So it's a lot of downside. It doesn't surprise me that the president didn't show up, but it's certainly not going to help him defend himself in this case.
Kezia, we come back to the age-old debate of why a victim doesn't report a crime at the time. It doesn't mean it should be dismissed. There are all sorts of reasons why that would be the case. She was told at the time she had a public profile and Trump's lawyers would demolish her. There's the self-denial that it was a rape. There's the self-blame. There are lots of common themes here that we see in sexual assault cases.
Yes, there are. But we've also seen evidence led in this case that immediately after the event, she told two of her friends exactly what had happened and swore them to secrecy. So that's quite an important bit of evidence, I would argue. And she also says the reason that she's making this an issue now is because she felt after the Me Too movement kind of took off, not just in America, but across the globe, she felt more of a duty to speak out, to be part of a kind of sisterhood, a group of women across the world who'd all had experiences like this with various powerful men in positions of great influence. So, I mean, that is definitely part of the evidence cadre that's being put against her by Donald Trump's lawyers. It's understandable that that was led. I can't imagine her lawyers were surprised that that was the type of arguments that were put forward. But look, ultimately, I think the reason Donald Trump didn't give evidence here is that if he ends up in a position where he loses this case, he's going to try and suggest it's a kangaroo court. He was never going to get a fair trial in the first place and feed those MAGA lines, which might help him towards the next presidential election.
Joe, of course, Donald Trump categorically denies this took place. But if he is found guilty here, what would be the implications criminally if you're found guilty in a civil case?
Well, Christian, it's just a civil case, so it's just money. So it could be a lot of money, but it's a monetary punishment, both in terms of compensating the victim for damage to her reputation, but as was pointed out earlier, possibly punitive damages, and that could be real money, which could be talking about possibly tens of millions of dollars or even more. So, but I think you're right. In the bigger picture, it's being found guilty, even though it's a civil charge, not a criminal one. I mean, look, to any other presidential candidate, that would be the end of one's political career. For Donald Trump, it's hard to believe that this is not even the most serious case he's facing right now. But certainly it's not going to help him.
Joe Moreno, you've teed up our next segment perfectly. Thank you very much for coming on this evening. As Joe suggests, whatever the verdict is, it's unlikely to have much effect on the polling. In fact, there's no sign at all that the string of legal challenges he's facing right now are in any way affecting his chance of securing the Republican nomination for 2024. In fact, the latest poll from Washington Post ABC out Sunday suggests it is Joe Biden that is sinking. His approval rating down to 36% from 42% in February. And in a head-to-head matchup against Donald Trump in 2024, it gets worse for Joe Biden. Trump is at 44%, Biden at 38%. Let's bring in Anthony Zer.